first thought about this address probably just over 30 years ago. It's just one of those things you want to do, but you never actually get around to doing it.
It's a long time thinking, David.
Yeah. It came about, I used to have a monthly article, a monthly in a magazine from Israel by some evangelical Jewish Christians. And they used to have very good articles on what was happening around in Israel and in Israel, along with prophecy. And I dare say you all remember a man called Yasser Arafat, who was a thorn in Israel's side for many a year. I think it was somewhere in the 80s or 90s. The PLO were in negotiations with Israel over the West Bank. And they came so close to coming to a deal. Even Yasser Arafat's right-hand man, I think it was Mr. Abbas, who's the current leader, I believe, of the PLO, and all his cabinet, as it were, said, "This is a brilliant deal, go for it, because you won't get a better one than this." But we know what happened. Yasser Arafat doesn't listen to people. He did it his own way. And he said no. And the article concluded saying, "We Israelis have been down this road before. Remember Pharaoh?" And we can see what happened. I reckon God hardened his heart, obviously, eventually to bring about God's will. But we've seen the scene, and we've set the scene in that reading of Exodus chapter 5. And Pharaoh, like any absolute ruler, like Putin, are not accustomed to people telling him what to do. After all, he was the mediator between the gods and humans, and would himself become a god when he passed on to the so-called next world. So when Moses and Aaron, just representatives of the slaves in Egypt, turn up and gave him an instruction from their God to let the Israelites go and offer sacrifices in the desert, he wasn't impressed. And neither would we be if we were in that situation. However, Moses and Aaron would not take no for an answer. They kept coming back to him each time with the same request, time after time after time. And on each occasion, they brought a dreadful plague upon the land of Egypt. But Pharaoh had to maintain his royal prestige, especially in the presence of his courtiers. So he steels himself against these two, what he would call troublesome people. And so in the Exodus narrative, we are told that Pharaoh's hardened his heart, or that his heart became hard. I've always been fascinated in how Pharaoh's heart was hardened. And there are three Hebrew words used. We're going to be looking at two mostly tonight. One is called hasak. It means to brace, to tighten up, to stiffen, which is the opposite of relaxing. There's kazar, which means to make sharp, hard, severe, or cruel. And kebed, to become heavy. Now, the first usage of this word, it has nothing to do with Pharaoh. It's in chapter 4, verse 4. And we can see in the context. He said, "The Lord said unto Moses, put forth thine hand and take it by the tail. And he put forth his hand and caught it, and it became a rod in his hand. And so he picked up the serpent, and it became a rod." And that word caught it, in my margin, has stiffened it. And it's the same word as hardened, as in Pharaoh's heart. Hasak, the next usage, is in chapter 4 and in verse 21. "And the Lord said unto Moses, when thou goest to return into Egypt, see that thou do all those wonders before Pharaoh, which I have put in thine hand, but I will harden his heart, and he shall not let the people go." Bullinger makes a comment on this verse. He says, it also means I will embolden. It's an idiom. It's a Hebrew idiom. It's a phrase. It's an active verb, apparently, of doing, and is used of suffering or permitting a thing to be done. So this is all part of God's will. And we have this idiom used in Genesis chapter 31. Again, where God's will is being worked out. And it's chapter 31 and verse 7. We know the incident pretty well of Laban and Jacob. And your father, so verse 6, and you know that with all my power I have served your father, and your father hath deceived me and changed my wages 10 times, but God suffered him not to hurt me. And we see there in verse 7, but God suffered him not to hurt me. And that's the same expression that is used in Exodus. And we can see where God is bringing about his will, but he's not hurting someone. So we start in chapter 7 and in verse 13, prior to the first plague. And he hardened Pharaoh's heart, that he hearkened not unto them, as the Lord had said. And so this is taking us again, isn't it, back to chapter 4 and verse 4. Then it appears that Pharaoh, for want of a better thing, has mood swings. He starts with 2 mood swings in the first plague, and then for the next 5 plagues he has 1 mood for each plague, and then 2 moods for the next 2, and then 1 each for the last 2. This must have been very annoying for Moses and Aaron, not knowing what mood he was going to be in. And I've documented these through plague by plague.
Ah.
And so in the first plague, we have him, first of all, becoming heavy, his heart become deadened, and then it stiffened up. Then in chapter 7, in verse 22, and the magicians of Egypt did so with their enchantments, and Pharaoh's heart was hardened, neither did he hearken unto them, as the Lord had said. That's in verse 22. Secondly, we have the second plague in chapter 8 and verse 15. But when Pharaoh saw that there was respite, he hardened his heart, and he hearkened not unto them, as the Lord had said. And so now we see that his heart again is heavy. And this time we are told that Pharaoh hardened his own heart. Now, on the 2 right-hand columns, you'll see some ticks, which are definite. Where they aren't ticks, I don't think you can be too sure one way or the other. So now we come to the 3rd plague in verse 19. But why was his heart hardened or became heavy? Probably because in verse 14, the land stank, and there was no need to stiffen up Pharaoh's heart. He was just glad there was a respite, and so his heart became heavy. And so when we come to the 3rd plague in verse 19, his heart was very heavy, and now it stiffens, Hasak. And so Moses and Aaron face another mood swing by Pharaoh. And then we come to the 4th plague in verse 32. And Pharaoh hardened his heart at this time also, neither would he let the people go. So Pharaoh is hardening his own heart, and it becomes heavy again. The 2nd time we are told that Pharaoh hardened his own heart. And then the 5th plague his heart is heavy again. In verse 17, it becomes heavier. And then the sixth plague, we have the boils in verse 12 of chapter 9. And the Lord hardened the heart of Pharaoh, and he hearkened not unto them. And the Lord had spoken unto Moses. This time we see God definitely hardens his heart. So we see another mood change, don't we? When he's stiffening up. The seventh plague, we have another mood change, and it becomes heavy again. The third time we are told Pharaoh's heart hardens his heart. And here we have another mood change with Pharaoh. And then all change again in chapter 10, verse 20, we have a tightening up, Hasak again. The fourth time God is mentioned as hardening Pharaoh's heart in the plagues. And you'll see there's a bit of appears to be a bit of a theme we're going through here, where we see in the first plague, it's mentioned twice. First heavy and then stiffens. In the seventh plague, it's mentioned twice. First heavy and then second. And it happens a bit later on as well. So the eighth plague of locusts, we have more mood changes in chapter 10 and verse 1. And the Lord said unto Moses, Go unto Pharaoh, for I have hardened his heart and the heart of his servants, that I might show these my signs before him. And we have the same, don't we, in verse 20. But the Lord hardened Pharaoh's heart, that he would not let the children of Israel go. And again, we see this format coming again. It starts heavy, and then it is strengthened. But notice in chapter 10 and verse 1, it's not just Pharaoh now, it's his servants. So their hearts are being hardened as well. When we come to the 10th plague of the killing of the firstborn, the 9th plague, we have another tightening up. And the fourth time God is mentioned as hardening Pharaoh's heart in the plagues. And the 10th plague, which we all know is the killing of the firstborn. Moses and Aaron hit a brick wall with Pharaoh as his heart for the third time in a row stiffens and it tightens up. So I'll try to show there the mood swings that is in, and that there is some kind of order, especially where it's mentioned twice during one plague. But notice there, the last four there, God did. God was hardening his heart in the 8th, the 9th, and the 10th plague. Why does the record tell us of this back and forth technique in describing Pharaoh's heart? It's all part, as one commentator says, of a brilliant diagnosis of the human condition, which is about the mysterious nature of human evil. God called Pharaoh to humble himself and acknowledge that God is his authority, and that he cannot redefine good and evil on Egyptian terms. And we see, don't we, Pharaoh's response in Exodus 5 and verse 2. And notice the eyes. Pharaoh said, Who is the Lord, that I should obey his voice to let Israel go? I know not the Lord, neither will I let Israel go. And we see this throughout with Pharaoh. It's what we call the big I am, isn't it? I'm the Pharaoh, and I'm in charge, and I'm not letting anybody else tell me otherwise. He balks at the God of Israel, And after this, God gives Pharaoh 5 opportunities to repent and to humble himself. And 5 times Pharaoh hardens his heart. I think the author here wants us to see that even the most heinous and absurd forms of human evil are not a true threat to God's purpose. He can steer even this kind of evil toward his plan to bless all humanity, eventually, as we know, through the promises that we know given to Abraham, Isaac and Jacob. And as Romans puts it on a few occasions, that God gave them up or gave them over to a reprobate mind, which is the same as God hardening their hearts after being given the chance to humble himself. The Apostle Paul reflects on this, but doesn't he, in Romans, using it to demonstrate the power of God's mercy over the human will, which includes the quote from Exodus 9. For this very purpose I have raised you up, that I might show my power in you, and that my name might be proclaimed in all the earth. So then he has mercy on whoever he wills, and he hardens whomever he wills. And so chance after chance, Pharaoh is given, and then God gives him another chance to reflect on what he's doing. And he takes no notice. And the 7th plague is another reminder of God's power. And then Pharaoh calls for Moses, doesn't he, in chapter 9 and in verse 27, where it says, and Pharaoh sent and called for Moses and Aaron and said unto them, I have sinned this time, the Lord is righteous, and I and my people are wicked. And then he asks for a reprieve. And then he renegades on it, doesn't he, in chapter 9 and in verse 34. When Pharaoh saw that the rain and the hail and the thunder were ceased, he sinned yet more and hardened his heart, he and his servants. Frustrating, isn't it, for Moses and for Aaron. Pharaoh knew he was sinning, but he carried on. I suppose we could think about that verse used by Paul, continue in sin, that grace may abound, but I don't think he had much knowledge about grace. The psalmist tells us, in his pride, the wicked man does not seek him. In all his thoughts, there is no room for God. Pride was the root of wicked Pharaoh's problem, a sin that hardened his heart over time and time, and he continued sinning, as we have just read in Exodus chapter 9. Hebrew warns us, doesn't it? Hebrews chapter 3, for a very good reason. Hebrews 3 verse 8, it's mentioned twice. 3 verse 8, harden not your hearts as in the provocation, in the day of temptation, in the wilderness. While it is said, verse 15, today if you will hear his voice, harden not your hearts, as in the provocation. A hardened and obstinate and a callous heart dulls a person's ability to understand the truth. And Jesus says this, doesn't he, to his own disciples. In Mark 8, in verse 16, we read, and they reasoned among themselves, saying, it is because we have no bread. And when Jesus knew it, he said unto them, why reason ye because ye have no bread? Perceive ye not yet, neither understand? Have ye your hearts yet hardened? Having eyes, see ye not, and having ears, hear ye not? And do ye not remember when I break the 5 loaves? And I wondered, as Jesus spoke those words to the disciples, did their mind go back to Pharaoh? It can cause people to resist and disobey God. This was certainly Pharaoh's issue. Seated in his own willful sin and lack of repentance, a deeply hardened heart is, as Timothy tells us, is like a seared conscience. God gives such people over to their sinful desires, emanating from a debased and a reprobate mind, as we have seen in Romans, pride and arrogance certainly can deceive and harden a heart. Well, I think it's good if we can turn to Daniel 5 and verse 20, where again we come across another ruler who had the same problem, didn't he? Daniel chapter 5 and verse 20. But when his heart was lifted up and his mind hardened in pride, he was deposed from his kingly throne, and they took his glory from him. And he was driven from the sons of men, and his heart was made like the beasts, and dwelling was with the wild asses. They fed him with grass like oxen, and body was wet with the dew of heaven, till he knew that the Most High God ruled in the kingdom of men, and that he will be appointed over it to whomsoever he will. And of course, he was speaking these words to Nebuchadnezzar's son, Belshazzar. And then, of course, we know the rest of the story, just before things went pear-shaped. Well, I don't think it's a coincidence that that is mentioned. This would be two great rulers of how pride brings about their end. Pharaoh, we know what became of Pharaoh. There are three words used which indicate a progression. We've only looked at two in Exodus chapter 7 and verse 3. It's just prior to the first plague and the serpent incident. This is a different word, and the word is kazar, which means to make sharp, hard, severe, or to be cruel. And this happened a long time before Moses and Aaron met up with Pharaoh, which they knew, because both were brought up in the royal household. And Pharaoh was already a tyrant. He was stiff-necked and cruel, but this was his character. So chapter 4, verse 21, where it is mentioned, he was in Midian, and he said he was going to stiffen his heart. Chapter 7, verse 3, prior to the first plague. And then in the first plague, his heart is stiffened. And then also in the first plague, it is deadened. And so we start with someone being cruel and then stiffened and then deadened. Again, we see a gradual progression. Seven verse 14, his heart became heavy and deadened, and is set like a stone against God. And so we have this build-up. We have build-up of this cruel tyrant who secondly puts his pride, puts his trust in his own strength and arrogance, which brings about a heavy and a deadened heart. And this sets the backdrop to the plagues. And we now see the cruelty of Pharaoh in the first, and we see it in the 10th. And so we can see after chapter 14, we see his heart is stiffened, and we see Pharaoh is going to pursue. In 14 verse 8, he's pursuing, and then the Egyptian army, their hearts are stiffened also. But notice on the right-hand side here, we have God hardening all their hearts. So again, I think here we have a pattern again with Pharaoh and with his army. I've always queried how long these plagues took. When we're at Sunday school and we read them, we kind of probably think, you know, it's probably a couple of weeks, maybe 3 weeks as you read it. If you say 4 days for each plague, and then you're looking at 40 days. Or was it 40 days and 40 nights that these plagues are actually taking place? Well, that's a fact. I think we can trace it back, because we know the death of the firstborn was around the time of the Passover, when the Passover was instituted. So we know that date. There's also another date, the hailstorm, February, March. We know that the flax ripened in mid-February. So from the 7th to the 10th plague, we basically got 6 weeks in that time alone. So I think from this we can actually work our way backwards, see how long it did actually take. But we can fill in some gaps here, can't we? Darkness. I don't know if some of you knew the late brother Harry Pratt from Clarke. He was originally from Wolverhampton. He was my first Sunday school teacher. And before he came to the truth, he served in the British Army in Egypt. And he told us about darkness. He says, because you couldn't see a thing with this sandstorm. The sand was everywhere. In your hair, your ears, your nostrils, your mouth, your clothes, your shoes. You couldn't cook. It was in your tent. Because they had tents in those days. They didn't have a mobile barracks hoisted on a flatbed. And that caused a lot of problems. And Brother Harry thought that darkness was brought about by the winds coming up from the Sahara. But through all of these plagues, one thing that stands out, the biggest miracle of all, is that it never affected the Jews at all. And the camp scene normally starts March. So that kind of ties up with that. So in that case, the locusts were probably in February or March. And that was probably brought upon by the hailstorm. So what learning from that can we go backwards? Well, gnats, midges, they are not very nice. At a certain time of the year, you don't go up to Scotland because you're getting bitten by gnats and midges. And I had the same thing in Egypt in October and November. So if that is be the case, then we can actually fill in the gaps. The flies, the stable fly, would have been in November. Death of the livestock would have been November/December, and the boils December/January, or maybe actually going into February. And so working backwards again, the Nile turned to blood. The fish die. It was a miracle, wasn't it, by God? Death on and in the Nile. And we know from all the records that we have that September is the annual flood season and the frog season. And of course, for this plague to take effect, that would have to be all over Egypt, up in all the canals and all the tributaries. And so that would be at the height of the flood season. So that just leaves the frogs and the toads, which would obviously follow in September and in October. So when you look at that, you're looking at probably around about 6-7 months, aren't you? Time from the time of the first plague to the 10th plague. But notice again here, there's a gradual feel for it, though, isn't there? The second plague came along because the frogs were forced ashore, they starve, and they dehydrate. And we know that if you've got rotting corpses, even though they be small, it attracts insects. So the gnats and the midges feed on the dead frogs and they breed rapidly. And then the same thing with the flies, which was probably a stable fly. That would have done exactly the same. Death of the livestock is an African, which is a well-known African disease called blue tongue. And this is spread by midges, by stable fly, and it's not very nice. These animals die within days. Then, of course, boils, skin infection by the stable fly. I don't know if you've ever been bitten by a house fly, and then you know what it feels like and what follows after. It's not very, very nice. And then we get the hailstorm. God uses the forces of nature. But notice when he brings that forward, it's at the start of the ripening season, because there are obviously other products that ripen later, and they are not taken out. It's just the first part that is taken out. The flax is ripened, and that's when that hailstorm comes. But of course, the hailstorm is an east wind where they can lay their eggs on damp sand or on damp ground, and that's where they breed. I think God, as I've said, we've probably caused the darkness by excessive winds from the Sahara. But in the end, you just think of what Moses and Aaron had to put up with. But they knew. God told them that he was going to continually say no. But of course, they had their faith in God. They knew that they would be freed. And of course, the nail in the coffin, as it were, for want of a better pun, was the death of the firstborn. That really, really hit home. And so we can see through these plagues alone, we can see God at work. We can see the miracles that he caused. And I think using natural elements. And just think of the effect that this would have on the Egyptian people. I mean, we've just gone through COVID, and we think we've been badly done by, with millions of people dying because of it. This must have hit their economy very, very hard. And over 7 months, they would have been absolutely exhausted. And so the death of the firstborn basically brought it to an end. But notice it starts with blood and it ends with blood, doesn't it? Nile turned to blood, and Israel was saved by the blood on the doorposts and the lintels. So what can we learn from the example here of hardening of Pharaoh's heart? Well, for me, it's the faith of Moses and Aaron. They stuck to it to the very end. They could have given up. 7 months to sort this out. Can't we do it quicker? And this is us, isn't it? We want to get things done and dusted. We want our will to be done. In the end, it's God's will that will be done in the way of his appointing, not how we wish to do it. But also the hardening of the heart. How many times do we harden our hearts? It's a question you can ask yourselves. I dare say we do harden our hearts. Some of us have strong views on certain things and we won't budge or whatever. We all are harden our hearts in one way or another. But as I said, the greatest miracle of all is that this did not touch the Israelites in the land of Goshen. Yet they had to take precautions. And the last plague, didn't they? They had to put the blood on the doorposts and on the lintels, and we all know what that speaks of and looks forward to. I'll just finish with a couple of quotations. I like this one because it reminds me of Egypt. I don't think the person who did this was thinking of Egypt, because they loved their horses, didn't they? Zechariah says, not by might nor by power, but by my spirit, says the Lord Almighty. And this is what Aaron and Moses knew. They knew that that might and that power and that spirit of God would bring about his will and gradually and eventually bring Pharaoh down to his knees, just as he brought Nebuchadnezzar down to his knees to show him who was in control of all things. And I said, wisdom is better than strength. Nevertheless, the poor man's wisdom is despised, and his words are not heard. And how true that is. And finally, their faith did not rest in the wisdom of men, but it rested in the power of God. And that's where Aaron's faith was. And that's where our faith should be also. Thank you.